Welcome back to J&M Bedtime Stories. Tonight we discuss true ghost stories. If you have an experience you'd like to share, please leave it in the comments below. If you like this video, please hit the thumbs up and consider subscribing. Turn on notifications so you won't miss future uploads. Now, let's get into it. I don't usually talk about this, but every time I pass a mirror, I can't help but glance over my shoulder. It started a couple of years ago, back when I was renting that old townhouse. You know the type, narrow hallways, warped wooden floors, the kind of place that creaks even when no one's walking around. One night I was up late, working on some project for work that I'd procrastinated on. It must have been around 2 in the morning when I got up to grab a glass of water. The house was dead silent, except for the hum of my computer and the occasional groan of the radiator. On my way to the kitchen, I had to pass this big antique mirror in the hallway. It came with the place, one of those heavy, ornate things with a gilded frame. I didn't think much of it at first, but that night, something felt off. As I walked by, I caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror. Not just my reflection, but something behind me, like a shadow flitting across the hallway. I froze, heart pounding, and turned around immediately. Of course, there was nothing there. Just the dimly lit hallway stretching back to the living room. I laughed it off, chalking it up to being overworked and sleep deprived. But as I turned back to the mirror, I swear I saw it again, this time clearer. A figure, tall and dark, standing just behind where I'd been. Its face was obscured, but it had this unnatural stillness, like it was watching me. I don't know what possessed me, but I reached out and touched the mirror. The surface was cold, colder than it should have been, like ice. My breath fogged up the glass for a second, and when it cleared, the figure was gone. That was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, weird things kept happening. Doors I'd locked would be ajar in the morning. Lights I was sure I'd turned off would be on again. And the mirror was the worst. Every time I walked by, I felt like I wasn't alone. Like something was just out of sight, waiting. One night I decided I'd had enough. I dragged the mirror out of the house and left it by the curb. As I walked back inside, I swear I heard a faint, low whisper. I moved out a month later. I didn't even care about breaking the lease, but sometimes, late at night, when I'm passing a mirror, I catch myself holding my breath, just in case something is there. And sometimes, I think I see it, the shadow waiting for me to notice. It started when I took that overnight job at the warehouse. You know the one, rows of shelves stretching forever, the hum of fluorescent lights that flicker just enough to be annoying. It was supposed to be easy money. Just scan the shipments, organize the boxes, and keep the place running until the morning crew arrived. The first couple of nights were uneventful, aside from how eerily quiet the place was after hours. The other night shifter, Carlos, had warned me about weird vibes, but I thought he was just trying to mess with the new guy. Then about a week in, I noticed something strange. Every so often I would hear this faint metallic sound. It wasn't the usual clanging of pipes or creak of the old shelving units. It was rhythmic, almost like footsteps echoing softly down one of the aisles. I told myself it was nothing, probably the building settling, or maybe a stray animal that had somehow gotten in. But then, on the fourth night, I saw it. I was in the back corner of the warehouse scanning some inventory when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, long and thin, darted between two shelves. I froze, my scanner lights still blinking, and stared into the darkness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the silence. No answer. I walked over, my heart thudding in my chest. The aisle was empty, just rows of boxes stacked neatly. I shook my head, muttering something about needing more sleep, and went back to work. But it kept happening. The shadows, the faint footsteps, the feeling that I wasn't alone. One night around 3 a.m., I was doing a final walkthrough when the lights in the far end of the warehouse flickered and went out completely. I stopped dead in my tracks. My flashlight barely pierced the darkness, but as I swung it around, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, at the end of the aisle, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, its outline barely visible in the dim light. But what froze me wasn't its shape. It was the way it moved. It didn't walk, it glided, like it wasn't touching the ground. I turned and bolted back from the front office, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial Carlos. When he finally picked up, I stammered something about seeing someone in the warehouse. He was quiet for a long moment before he said, "You saw it, didn't you?" "What are you talking about?" I demanded. Carlos sighed. "It's why I'm quitting next week. Everyone who works the night shift sees it eventually. Don't bother calling security. It never shows up on the cameras." I didn't finish my shift that night. I left and never went back. But sometimes when I drive by the warehouse, I think about that figure, and I wonder if it's still there, gliding silently between the aisles, waiting for someone else to notice it. I used to work at a law firm, one of those old school places with dusty file cabinets lining the walls and creaky office furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. My job was pretty straightforward. Handle client records, organize documents, and stay late when the lawyers needed something done yesterday. The building itself was ancient, with high ceilings and narrow hallways that echoed every little sound. I didn't think much of it until the night I had to stay late to finish filing a case. It was around 10 p.m. and the office was deserted except for me. Everyone else had gone home hours ago. I was sorting through a stack of files when I noticed one I hadn't seen before, a red folder with no label. That was strange. Everything in the office was meticulously categorized. Curious, I opened it. Inside there were old yellowed papers, handwritten in a script I could barely read. The dates on the documents were from the early 1900s, long before the firm was established. There were client names, but no case numbers or summaries, just strange phrases like, "The estate cannot be claimed," and "for the sins of the keeper." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I shrugged it off. I figured someone had found an old file and slipped it into the stack as a joke. As I reached for another folder, the lights in the hallway flickered. That wasn't unusual. The wiring in the building was ancient. But then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like papers being shuffled. I froze. The office was dead silent. I stood up and glanced down the hallway. The light at the far end was flickering, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing. No response. I sat back down, determined to finish quickly and leave. But as I continued working, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. Then I heard it again, rustling, closer this time. I looked at the desk and my heart dropped. The red folder which I had left closed was now open, its pages spread out as if someone had been reading them. I grabbed the folder, intending to put it away and forget about it, but as I stood up, I caught a glimpse of something in the glass partition of the office next door. A reflection, a figure standing behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. My heart was racing now. I shoved the red folder back into the filing cabinet and slammed it shut. As I turned to grab my bag, the lights flickered again, and this time I heard it clearly, a whisper. "Leave it alone." I didn't stop to think. I bolted out of the office, leaving my work unfinished. The next morning, I told my boss about the red folder, but when we went to look for it, it was gone. The cabinet was locked and none of the keys worked. I quit a week later. I couldn't handle being there at night anymore. But sometimes I wonder, if I had stayed, would I have found out who or what wanted me to leave that folder alone? Growing up, I always felt there was something wrong with the house I lived in. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to be haunted, just a normal suburban home with white siding and a tidy little lawn. But there was this one room, at the very end of the upstairs hallway, that gave me chills. The door was always shut. My parents told me it was just a storage room, full of old furniture and boxes we didn't have space for. But even as a kid, I noticed they avoided it. Whenever they needed something from inside, they'd get it quickly, never lingering longer than they had to. I asked once why I couldn't go in there. My mom just said, "It's not a place for kids." That was it. One summer, when I was about 10, my parents left me home alone for a few hours. I was bored and curious, so I decided to check out the forbidden room. I remember standing outside the door, my hand hovering over the knob, trying to work up the courage to turn it. But finally, I did. The door creaked open and the smell hit me first, stale and musty, like the air hadn't moved in years. The room was dim, the only light coming from a tiny window partially covered by a faded curtain. It was filled with old furniture and dusty boxes, just like my parents said. But there was something else. In the center of the room there was a chair, a simple wooden chair, nothing fancy. It was just facing the corner, like someone had been sitting there, staring at the wall. I stepped inside and the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. As I moved closer to the chair, I noticed scratches on the wall in front of it, long, deep grooves like someone had clawed at the plaster. I reached out to touch the chair, but before my fingers could graze the wood, I heard a low creaking sound, like the weight of someone shifting in a seat. I froze. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it might drown out the sound. Slowly, I turned around. The room was empty. I ran out of there so fast I almost tripped on the stairs. I didn't tell my parents what I'd seen, but I started avoiding that end of the hallway entirely. Years later, when I was in high school, my mom finally told me the truth. The house had belonged to an older relative before us, a man who had grown increasingly unstable after his wife had passed. He spent most of his time in that room, sitting in that chair, staring at that wall. And one day, he just disappeared. No one knows what happened to him. We moved out not long after that, but even now I can't shake the memory of that chair and the feeling that I wasn't alone in that room. Sometimes I wonder if he ever really left, or if he's still sitting there, waiting for someone else to notice him. When I was a kid, the woods behind our neighborhood were my favorite place to play. They seemed endless back then, a maze of towering trees and winding paths that led to who knows where. My friends and I would spend hours exploring, making up games and pretending we were adventurers in some far-off land. There was one spot, though, that always gave me an uneasy feeling. Deep in the woods there was a massive old tree with a hollow at its base. The hollow was big enough for a kid to crawl into, and it seemed to breathe mystery. The bark around it was darker than the rest of the tree, almost scorched, and the air around it always felt colder, even on the hottest summer days. We called it the wishing tree. Some older kids in the neighborhood told us stories about how you could make a wish by leaving something inside the hollow. They said the tree would grant your wish, but it always took something in return. One day, my best friend Jake dared me to try it. He had this old beat-up slingshot he'd been carrying around forever, and he swore up and down that he'd wished for it at the tree years ago. I didn't believe him, but I was curious. So I grabbed a marble from my pocket, one of my favorites, a shiny green one with swirls of gold, and crouched in front of the hollow. As I got closer, I swear I felt something shift. The air seemed heavier, and the woods grew eerily quiet. Even the birds stopped chirping. I almost chickened out, but Jake was watching, so I shoved the marble into the hollow and whispered, I wish I could beat Jake at anything for once. I stood up, dusted off my knees, and laughed it off. Nothing happened. But the next day, everything changed. We were playing our usual games, tag, hide and seek, all the stuff we always did, but suddenly, I was winning. Every time. Jake couldn't catch me, couldn't find me, couldn't hit a single shot with his slingshot. At first I thought it was luck, but it kept happening over and over. Jake got frustrated, really frustrated. He started avoiding me, and when I asked him what was wrong, he just muttered something about cheating and stormed off. Then weird things started happening. My other friends avoided me too, saying I gave them the creeps. My parents noticed I was restless at night, waking up from strange dreams where the woods seemed alive, whispering my name. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I went back to the tree. The hollow seemed darker now, deeper, like it had grown since the last time I'd seen it. I crouched down and whispered, "Take it back." The woods were silent for a long moment, and then I felt it, a rush of wind that seemed to come from the hollow itself, chilling me to the bone. The next day, things went back to normal, or so I thought. Jake was friendly again, and I wasn't winning everything anymore, but something about the woods felt different. I stopped going back there. Years later, when the neighborhood expanded and the woods were cleared for new houses, I heard that the workers found something buried near the tree, something small, wrapped in rotted fabric, with strange carvings etched into the woods nearby. I didn't ask for details. I didn't want to know. To this day, I keep away from deep woods, and I never make wishes I can't take back. I used to work the night shift at St. Vincent's Hospital. It was a quiet place most of the time, the kind of hospital where nothing major happened, but everyone who worked there knew about the 4th floor. Technically, the floor was closed. It used to be a psych ward years ago, but it was shut down after the hospital expanded. The staff said it was for budget reasons, but there were whispers of something else. Patients disappearing, strange accidents, things that didn't make it into the official reports. I didn't pay much attention to the rumors at first. My job was to handle medical supplies and paperwork, and the closed-off 4th floor was the last thing on my mind. Then one night, I was sent to inventory supplies and storage. The storage area was on the 3rd floor, but when I got there, the elevator doors didn't open like they should have. Instead, the panel lit up with a button I hadn't pressed. 4. I tried pressing other buttons, but nothing worked. The elevator creaked and groaned as it rose, and when the doors finally opened, I found myself staring down a dark, empty hallway. The lights were dim, barely flickering, and the air smelled stale, like the place hadn't been touched in years. I thought about hitting the closed door button, but something, curiosity maybe, or plain stupidity, made me step out instead. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with old patient rooms. Most of the doors were closed, but one near the end was slightly ajar, and I swear I saw movement inside. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the eerie silence. No one answered. I walked towards the open door, my footsteps echoing against the tiled floor. Inside was an old hospital bed, its mattress stripped bare. The window was covered in grime, letting in only a faint glow from the street lights outside. And then I saw a figure standing in the corner. At first I thought it was just a shadow, but it was too solid, too still. "Is someone there?" I asked. The figure didn't move, but the air around me grew colder, biting into my skin, and then it whispered, low and raspy, almost like a breath, "Help me." I stumbled back, my heart racing. The figure stepped forward, and I saw it clearly for the first time. A woman in a hospital gown, her face pale and sunken, her eyes hollow and dark. I bolted back to the elevator, slamming the button over and over until the doors finally shut. As the elevator descended, I heard it, faint footsteps, like someone was following me, growing quieter the further I went. When I got back to the 3rd floor, I told a nurse what happened. She looked at me, her face pale, and said, You shouldn't have gone up there. I quit a month later. I couldn't shake the feeling that something from the fourth floor was still with me. Sometimes when I'm alone, I hear whispers, soft, raspy, and pleading. And sometimes I think about that figure standing in the corner, waiting for someone else to notice her. When I was about 8, my family lived in a small old house on the edge of a quiet neighborhood. My bedroom was on the second floor, and it had this big window that overlooked the backyard. I used to love sitting by that window during the day, watching the birds and squirrels. But at night it was different. The backyard looked darker than it should have, even with the moonlight. The trees seemed to shift, and the shadows stretched out like they were alive. One night I woke up for no reason. My room was completely silent, and the only light came from the street lamp far off in the distance. I don't know what made me do it, but I turned to look at the window, and then I saw her. There was a girl standing just outside my window. She looked about my age, with long, tangled hair and a pale face. Her eyes were huge, too big for her face, and they seemed to glow faintly in the dark. I froze. My house was 2 stories tall. There was no way anyone could be standing outside my window, but there she was, staring in at me. I pulled the covers over my head and squeezed my eyes shut, hoping she'd go away. After what felt like forever, I peeked out again. She was still there, but now she was smiling. This wide, unnatural grin that showed way too many teeth. I wanted to scream for my parents, but I couldn't make a sound. It was like the air had been sucked out of the room. And then, slowly, she raised her hand and tapped on the glass. The sound snapped me out of my paralysis. I bolted out of the bed and ran to my parents' room, tears streaming down my face. I told them what I'd seen, but when they came back to check, there was nothing there. My dad even went outside with a flashlight, but the yard was empty. They told me it was just a nightmare, but I know what I saw. And after that, I refused to sleep in that room. I camped out on the floor of my brother's room for weeks, and even when I went back, I never opened the curtains again. Years later, I mentioned the girl in the window to my mom. She got quiet for a moment and then said, "You know, the people who lived there before us moved out because their daughter passed away. She fell out of that window." I don't know if she was trying to scare me or if she was serious, but I still get chills thinking about it. To this day, I can't sleep in a room with uncovered windows. I'm too afraid of what I might see looking back at me. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and consider subscribing. Turn on notifications so you won't miss a future episode. Until next time, stay curious.